Hi, and welcome to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast presented by Wolf Precision Incorporated, where we learn about and share long range shooting and custom rifle building. I am your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome to the show. Hi, and welcome to episode 49 of Wolf Precision's Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Dotson, and welcome to the show. In this episode, we are going to continue on our reloading series, and we're talking about getting into reloading ammunition. And in this particular episode, we are going to be discussing selecting a caliber, as well as gathering up the components necessary, some things to think about, food for thought. We're also going to give some quick updates for our long-range shooting school for the rest of the summer. We're excited to announce some individual one-day events that we're going to be doing. So without further ado, here we go. All right, so in episode 48, we talked about reloading, getting into reloading, some things to take into consideration while you're considering it. In this episode, we're going to continue on this series and start talking about selecting components as well as caliber selection. So when we start talking about caliber selection, you might go, well, that's sort of an off topic for reloading, but what we're talking about here is new reloaders, as well as potential hunters, people who are going to travel maybe across the country or even around the world and thinking about getting into hand loading, maybe to make some more accurate ammunition than that which they can buy, as well as, using different bullets, because there are a lot of great bullets out there that may not come in loaded ammunition. So when it comes to caliber selection, there's a couple things you want to just think about. Just pause and think a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish and maybe what your goals are. Number one right out of the gate is be careful selecting a caliber that I would consider like high maintenance. So we're talking about maybe a caliber that's difficult to find a load for, or is really picky as far as getting a load settled in. And there are some calibers out there, in my opinion, that are that way. So, for example, the 6mm by 47, from those that I know that shoot it, say that it can be a little finicky when it comes to reloading. Maybe not a great choice. I think maybe for a new reloader that's wanting to learn the art of reloading, number one, staying with the caliber that has an abundance of factory ammunition that you can shoot while working on your hand loads and enjoying the rifle, so it doesn't pigeonhole you. So, for example, maybe your first rifle for hand loading, 6-dasher might not be the best route to go, simply because the only time you're going to shoot it is with your hand loads, and so it forces you to go down that hole, and if you're having any trouble, you're going to not be able to enjoy your rifle. So maybe the 6.5 Creedmoor, for example, would be a great choice. Another thing to take into consideration when we're talking about how easy some rounds are to reload for than others would be, for example, my personal favorite is the 308. It's just one of those really easy rounds to load for. It can cover a wide variety of things that you would like to do with it, whether you're a hunter or you're getting into varmint hunting or you want to shoot it in some matches, maybe in an FTR class, or maybe the law enforcement division of PRS, something like that, where 223 or 308 is required. But I think the 308 is a super easy cartridge to reload for. I think the 223 falls in that same category. Then you get into calibers that might not have the support from factory ammunition, but still I think are super easy to reload for, would be something like the 6BR. The 6BR is one of the easiest cartridges to reload for, I think, out there, but it makes you shoot reloads only. There isn't a big market of factory ammunition that's out there readily available, as well as inexpensive. So that's just a word of caution on that one. The other thing to take into consideration is if this is a hunting gun. So, for example, if you plan on going to a big game hunt in Alaska, for example, then maybe considering a caliber that has factory ammunition readily available in the area that you're going to be traveling to. A customer of ours calls it the Walmart test. So, when he selects his hunting rifle, like, for example, the 30-06, the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 300 Win Mag, almost every Walmart in the United States has that. If you're going to Africa, 300 Win Mag is a very common caliber. So if you're going to go on a sheep hunt, for example, in Alaska, then maybe the 6.5 by 284 isn't really a great cartridge to consider starting to reload for, because number one, you're going to be starting from scratch, and number two, there isn't factory ammunition heavily supporting it. And so if you go on a hunt and your ammunition gets lost, your favorite hand loads that you spent all this time working up for the rifle, for the event that you're going to, and then when you get there, you find out that your ammunition is lost and you're not going to find it anywhere. So just some food for thought. I would really try to select a caliber that's heavily supported as far as factory ammunition. That way you can shoot it and enjoy it, and maybe even have it a baseline. You know, like my goal is to shoot better than factory ammunition in a 6.5 Creedmoor. And so you can go out and enjoy the rifle. You have a baseline accuracy that the rifle is capable of doing with factory ammunition, and then you can enjoy the rifle while you're working on your hand loads, which is a nice thing to do. And then the other thing, of course, we just talked about was picking calibers that you're going to reload for, but also take on hunting trips. That's a big one. Believe it or not, it's really common, or maybe I should rephrase that, it's not uncommon for ammunition not to show up. We have recently a customer that come in for a one-day private event here that said that his ammunition got lost on his way to Africa. And we hear that story quite often, whether it's lost, stolen, confiscated, whatever. You show up there with a really hard caliber to find factory ammunition for, and you're going to be using the guide's rifle for your hunt. So that's just some food for thought. Now, selecting components for such calibers now falls into another category. So we're just going to talk a little bit about selecting different components and some things to think about when you're getting ready to reload. For example, like the 6.5 Creedmoor, 308, 223. There's such a huge database of information, wealth of knowledge out there for these calibers, for the different bullets, the charge weights, and the powders that you're going to select when you're reloading them. Other calibers, for example, like maybe the 22 Creedmoor, it just doesn't have a lot of data out there yet. So, you know, you're going to be flying by the seat of your pants, or going by a couple people's personal experiences or privately published loads that really aren't from the factory yet. And when you're selecting powder and starting to do the research to select and get your components, there's a couple of things to think about. Number one, I try to stay with the best quality brass that I can get. So if we're shooting, let's just say the 6.5x47 Lapua, you're going to shoot Lapua brass. If you're shooting the 6.5 Creedmoor, well, there's lots of different brass makers out there, as well as you could start reloading your own brass that you're shooting factory ammunition from. So let's just say you go out and you buy a couple cases of 6.5 Creedmoor ammunition loaded by Hornady. Well, then you get to keep the brass and start working on your loads after you get a chance to enjoy the rifle for a while. Same thing with Berger bullets. Berger is reloading. They're selling loaded ammunition, and from what I understand, some of the calibers are shooting Lapua brass. Well, that's awesome, because that's really some of the best brass that you can buy. If you're going to start from scratch, though, a couple of things to think about is, A, try to buy the best brass that you can. And so, for example, if the brass, if I know this is going to be a rifle I'm going to spend a lot of time with, if Lapua makes the brass for it, I'm going to buy Lapua brass. And I try to buy it in a little bit bigger quantities. So, for example, I know the average rifle might last for 2,000 to 3,000 rounds, and so I might buy 300 pieces of brass right out of the gate, or even 400. That way I have lots of 100 in boxes ready to go. So if I'm going to a match and I'm going to reload 200 or 300 rounds, not only do I have enough to practice with before the match out of that batch, but then I have plenty to shoot the match. And even when I get home, you know, I still have extra ammunition. So I don't want to constantly have to go home every time I need ammunition and reload. If I'm going to sit down and do a nice batch of ammunition, I'm going to do 200, 300, maybe even 400 in an afternoon. And that way I'm not being burdened with it every week. Or if I decide out of the blue I want to run to a match on a Saturday and today's Thursday, I'm not rushing downstairs trying to make ammunition. I can say, oh man, I got an extra 200 rounds downstairs. I could easily do this match and still have some left, which is, you know, a really good way to go. So selecting good quality brass. Small primer pockets versus large primer pockets. They say you get better standard deviations. For example, Using Lapua brass, you can get small primer pockets in 6.5 Creedmoor, and I believe you can get that in 308 as well. They're making Bentress cartridges with small primer pockets for a reason. So it's up to you. Just be careful with some rifles that you need bushed firing pins to use small primer pocket brass. The Bat Tactical Actions that we use here are proprietary firing pin that can shoot both large and small primers. And so it doesn't matter what you want to feed through it. Either or will work, but just a word of caution that that's not true across the board. Selecting powder. Here's a couple pointers I can give you. Number one, make sure that you're using powder, at least in what we do, that's not temperature sensitive. And so there's lots of old powders out there that have been around forever that are great powders. For example, a lot of 308 powders from years past are still out there, and the loads still shoot great, but they are known to be temperature sensitive. So as the temperature goes up or goes down, you're going to start getting variations in your speed. Well, that's not good for us as hunters or competition shooters. So as the day goes along and your ammunition warms up, or the day gets really hot and the next day it cools off, it's just one less thing to have to worry about. And so I like to use like Hodgdon's Extreme line of powders, like H4350, H4831 Shortcut, Varget. All of these things are known to be less temperature sensitive, and it's just not leaving you exposed to having some issues with powder or speeds as temperatures go up and down. When you're working with powder, just know that, and I learned this from Hodgdon's directly. I spoke with Chris years ago, and we were talking about temperature sensitivity, and we did some testing with H4831 Shortcut, which is a really common 264 Win Mag type powder, or I even used that in 300 Win Mag. But we tested it in 90-degree summer weather shooting woodchucks, and I had a really nice cold snap come through here in Pennsylvania. Took the ammunition, rifle, everything out to the car. It was 10 below zero. I went to the range the next day, 10 below zero. Could barely keep my gloves off long enough to shoot. And my swing in temperature was about 15 to 18 feet per second from what my summer load was. And I thought that was really impressive. There is some issues that come with powder either being kept in non-humid environments or powders being kept in garages that get super hot in the summertime. When I spoke with the guys at Hodgdon's about this, one of the things that they recommended was keeping your powder in the same place that you reload and keeping a really close eye on the humidity. And they often give, I think a baseline of what, when they test it there, what humidity it should be at. So if you want to call and speak with some experts in the field, spend some time calling and saying, hey, do you care if I ask you a couple of technical questions about what humidity this should be kept at, and some tips to keep the powder in great condition, as well as keeping it from drying out or collecting too much moisture. I did learn that a lot of powder that is stored outdoors, especially if it's in the winter or in the summertime, especially for the people that sell it, that it can dry out. So if it's kept in Arizona or in South Dakota, North Dakota, in an outdoor building, it's 20 below zero. It can draw the moisture out of the powder, and that can change not only your speed, but your pressure. And what the advice they gave me, and you can call and verify this, or maybe we'll bring them on and we'll do a small interview with them about the subject. But what they recommended to me to make sure that we kept the humidity or of the actual powder itself, or the amount of moisture in it, the same as we keep all of our powder in the same area. And when we get new batches, we'll actually take the lids off for a day and sort of let them stabilize in that environment. And if they are dried out a little bit, they'll draw that moisture back in and sort of stabilize at the humidity point that we keep our room in. And so I think that's just a little side note, because if you get a new 8-pound can of powder and you store it in your outside garage, and that's where you're reloading, and it gets 115 degrees in there in the summertime, I'm told that can cause some problems. I'm not an expert in this field, guys. I don't manufacture powder. I'm only passing along really good information from people that I trust in the industry that have shared some of this stuff with me. So just some food for thought there. Going on and selecting the rest of your components is you're going to get into your primers. and we use match primers. I use CCI match primers specifically, and knowing that some of the primer cups can be harder and softer depending on the manufacturer and who's making them at the time. We have had experiences here where we got soft primer cups from other manufacturers in the middle of a shooting school. And although we weren't piercing primers, they were certainly getting big dimples, and you could see where they were blowing back and sort of going around the firing pin, and you could sort of feel it with your thumbnail, some things to look for. But we use CCI match primers. I believe they're a little harder cup, so they're not going to have some of the other issues as some of the soft primers. If you're shooting an AR-15, again, this isn't reloading teaching. This is food for thought. There are primers that have even harder cups that sometimes they recommend, so less of a chance of piercing a primer, stuff like that. So do your research, contact the manufacturers, ask lots of questions as to which primers we should use for this particular caliber and rifle that we're shooting in and why. Again, this is sort of the fun part of what we do is you get to call all these cool people and ask them questions that they've been asked, but honest to God, they enjoy talking about it, and you might be the third person that day that's called and asked that very same question, but they'll probably take the time to go over it. It's what they do. It's what they like. So that's the fun part. Then bullets. Here's what I would talk about when you get into selecting bullets and components in selecting bullets is some bullets are actually finicky on seating depth. And we're going to talk about setting up and reloading in our next podcast. So we're not going to get into that too much here. But there are bullets that have a design in them that they're very sensitive to the seating depth. And as your lens and grooves or your throat starts to erode and moves away from your bullet, you can start to lose your accuracy simply because the bullet does not like the jump, as we call it. I like to pick out bullets that it doesn't matter. They're really tolerable for big jumps. So, for example, our school rifles here, we shoot the 140 grain ELD match. It doesn't care whether the rifle has 2,000 rounds or 200 through it. We can shoot factory ammunition through it, and it shoots the same, even though one is shooting and jumping a lot farther because we're basically burning the throats out of the barrels. And so I like to stay with bullets that aren't high maintenance. You know, in all of this, I guess if you can sort of start to see a theme develop, and anything that you do, there can be pros and cons. And when I'm starting to select components, I try to select things that have the least amount of potential issues that come along with selecting that component. I'm trying to keep out a lot of the variables that we know can happen, or using components that we know have issues or can have issues, or picking calibers that we know can be high maintenance, or powders that can have fluctuations. I mean, these are all things that, when I'm checking the boxes and selecting my components, I'm very careful of the attached list of things that these products can potentially have trouble with. I am trying to make this the smallest amount of stress on me as possible, the smallest amount of known variables that can cause issues, and so I can easily come up with a really nice working load and enjoy the rifle and not be in a high maintenance relationship. Because let's face it, you're going to spend a lot of time with this rifle. You're going to go out and shoot. This is supposed to be enjoyable. And so I don't think you really want to turn it into a super high maintenance relationship. And that's sort of how I approach the reloading process as well. Now, before I get into talking about buying some of the dies and things and tools that we're going to have to purchase when we're getting into reloading, I do want to take a time to talk about, since we are talking about shooting, is shooting well. And going along with shooting well means having a great trigger in your firearm. So whether you're shooting a custom rifle or factory rifle, the one part that's in motion while you're firing is your trigger. And having a really great, clean braking trigger is super important to long-range shooting or for accurate shooting. It's just simply the way it is. And so if you're going to replace your trigger, or if you are building a custom rifle, we highly recommend that you consider using Trigger Tech triggers. It's what we use here. It's what we have used for many years. We rely on their ability to work flawlessly, as well as clean brakes and a safe trigger. So if you are in the market for an aftermarket trigger, or if you just simply want to try to shoot a little bit better, you're going to go out and do all of this hand loading and you're trying to get the best groups down range, having a crappy trigger in your gun isn't going to help the rest of this process go well. If you're going to replace your trigger to shoot better, then buy a better trigger. So if you're going to go through all that, then why not replace it with a really good one? And we recommend TriggerTech. So going back to selecting components to reloading, you're going to have to select some dies, and you're going to have to start getting some little bits and bobs and pieces put together. And we want to take a few minutes to talk about some of these parts and pieces. With this whole process, you can make it as complicated or as simple as you like. But here's some food for thought. When you're getting into reloading, especially starting, remember we talked about single stage presses, but I use full length sizing dies. I don't use anything with neck bushings. I don't neck size. I use full length sizing dies. And the reason I think that's really important for you to consider doing for your first bout with reloading is it's going to work the brass, it's going to bump the shoulder, it's going to size the neck, and it's going to have an expander ball to open it back up without you having to worry about different bushings, different expander balls, not bumping the shoulder on just neck dies and getting stiff bolt closes. There's a lot of people that like neck sizing or using different bushings, controlling neck tension to their specific needs, and bench rest is really into this world. F-class is into this world. I have never felt that I was not able to great shooting loads by using a full-length sizing die. There are some pros and cons to using the other types of dies. Number one, you can get donuts formed. You can get a ring right around the base of the neck, what we call the neck-shoulder junction, and it's basically a donut. If you run a pen or something with a little paper clip on the inside of the brass after you fired it a couple times, or if you're just neck sizing only, or sometimes even using bushings, they'll squeeze right down to the bottom of that neck, but then they form this thick spot. And what happens is that gets moved to the inside when you size it, and then as you're seating bullets, you'll actually feel it hit that donut. And basically, you've got your donut, which is a thicker portion of the neck, this small little area, holding the bullet extremely tight and sometimes forcing it off center. There's all kinds of bad stuff that can happen with donuts. Pinching your bullet, the outside wall of the actual chamber at the neck. So you've got this thick donut that's formed, and you closing the round in there, and this donut is pinching the bullet into the case, not letting it go. We had 6.5 284 customer loaded the ammunition here, that when he was closing his bullet, he was almost blowing his primers clean out because he had reloaded this brass so many times, and he had donuts formed, didn't realize it, and the donuts were pinching the bullet as he was closing the bolt on the gun. And so there's all these pros and cons to think about. This can open up a lot of bad doors for new shooters because they're just not experienced enough to find it, to recognize it, or even to fix it. There are some fixes like advanced hand loading techniques that have things like neck turning onto the shoulder to get rid of donuts. We used to have to do that with 260s because they were very common to get donuts. But to avoid a lot of this stress right out of the gate is maybe consider getting a full-length sizing die. They're very inexpensive. They're the most common. You can get a Redding. You can get a Hornady, a Forster. Forster has a really nice expander area that as your brass goes up into your press, the neck is squished down. And then as you pull it back out, it's opened up with an expanding mandrel inside. Redding makes a carbide button that you can replace the expander inside the die with. That is a little less stressful on the neck, as well as a little bit more concentric. It self-aligns and pulls itself straight out. So if you get a full-length sizing die from Redding, you can buy what we call a carbide button, which will help a little bit in just that neck area. That's what we do here, and I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. I've tried all the other routes. We have customers that shoot all the other routes. We see all the problems that can happen, and it would just be a shame for that stuff to start happening to you and having all kinds of problems, not enjoying the reloading, simply because you're using advanced techniques and things are going wrong and you're just not prepared or at that level yet to catch it. So that's another thing to take into consideration. The other key with this, and we get this call all the time, with standard deviations and just different spikes and speeds, and make sure that if you're going to take the time to full length size all of your brass, which is what we do here, that you plan on finishing the whole process of reloading, ending with loaded ammunition. So in other words, make sure you get a bullet inside that case mouth that day. Do not let that size all of your cases and then let them set and pull handfuls out at a time and then start seating bullets, because the expander balls, as your brass comes back out of your press, forces your neck open, but in essence makes a little bit of a spring effect. So as time goes on, the neck wants to close again and go back to sort of its original form. This can cause issues with the amount of pressure it takes to seat the bullet, as well as the neck tension holding the bullet. So make sure that one way to avoid having this problem and having some weird stuff happening at the range is, if you're going to take the time to full-length size the brass, make sure that you get a bullet in that case that day. Don't wait a couple days. You're going to buy a competition seating die. Now, here's one thing that I will say that I would recommend highly is get a really good quality competition seating die. Again, Hornady makes one, Redding makes a top-of-the-line one, Forster makes a top-of-the-line one. It has, a dial indicator on it that you can adjust your seating depth pretty accurately and know how much you're turning rather than just guessing. That's going to help align the bullet better into the case. There's just a lot of benefits to using a competition seating die, so I would certainly recommend buying a competition seating die. They are a lot more expensive, but that is one area I think that is worth the investment. And then be careful on your seating stem. You just have to do a little research on this, but for example, Hornady makes everything from round nose bullets to ELD matches with that really long, sharp tip. Berger makes VLD bullets with a very long, pointed tip, and you could be seating off the tip of the bullet with some stems. In other words, they make different stems that are inside the die that as the bullet is being seated into the case, it's holding the outside or around the bullet maybe a little bit further back from the tip. So in other words, it's not pushing on the tip directly. But those long, skinny bullets can bottom out in some of the seating stems. So you're not seating it properly by holding on the outside edge of the bullet. You're actually seating it by the tip. And so sometimes you do have to buy an extra stem. They call it a seating stem for VLD type bullets that allow you to seat those really long bullets properly and make sure that you're pushing the bullet in with it touching the bullet in the appropriate places, not off the tip. So there's just another thing to think about when you're getting into this. We talked about, getting ready to throw your powder. I do recommend learning to do it off a balance beam scale. There's less chance of error. There's less chance of it floating around. You can physically see what you're throwing, and they are actually really good scales. And so I hand throw the charge just under the weight that I want. I set it on the balance beam scale, and then I just trickle it up to the appropriate level and then dump the powder charge. If you do go with an electronic scale, make sure you read the instructions, make sure you set it up properly, make sure she's calibrated. They do float sometimes, and so halfway through reloading process, it's not throwing what you think it is. There's constant over and unders where you're getting more powder or less powder, and you're having to restart it over and over again. With a balance beam scale, I think it just makes it a little bit simpler and cleaner. And when I reload, I put about, if I'm going to reload a lot, I'll have trays with 50 rounds on each tray. And I'll see the full-length size. I'll put the new primers in, and then I'm throwing my powder charge. Now, here's one thing that I do is I make sure that all 50 have powder in them before I move that lot over to start seating bullets. And then I physically check with a flashlight inside each case to make sure that I have powder in each and every of those cases. Remember, we talked about squid loads, how extremely dangerous they can be. And so just make sure you physically check inside each of those cases to make sure that you didn't get distracted and you missed one. Then they get moved on to the next stage, and you can start setting up to seat bullets, or you can put powder in the next 50 and then slide them over. Then put powder in the next, and then you'll seat all the bullets all together after you physically check them all. You are going to buy some case lube. We use Hornady One Shot. They're not sponsors here. We do like it, and I also lube inside the case mouth a little bit. So I'll flip the cases in, maybe mouth down, and I'll spray them, and then I'll turn them over, and I'll spray them with the shoulders up, mouth up, and I just make sure I get a little bit inside there so it helps with the lubrication of seating the bullets. I've never had any problem with it. With any types of lubes like this, of course, always make sure you read the instructions. Make sure you clean your dies before you start reloading. And if there's anything in there when it's new, whether, sometimes it's cosmoline or different greases and oils, or as they're being used, you can pull them out and clean them and make sure that there's not a lot of buildup inside of them or carbon. Also, touching base just really quick on annealers. I don't anneal brass yet, and I've been doing this a long time. I'll sometimes shoot my brass between 3 and 7 reloads, and then I throw them away. And what I find is in the annealing process, at least years ago, it used to be setting in a dark room and heating up to either a visual temperature, and I just couldn't feel comfortable doing 200, 300, 400 pieces and that they would all be the same. And if you anneal wrong and you anneal the whole case and make it soft or soft in areas it's not supposed to be, you can make something very dangerous. So I choose not to anneal at this point. Now, they are making different annealing machines that are taking some of that guesswork out. And so the technology is making it more fail-safe. There's a new electric one that works really well. One of our instructors is using. He just loves it to pieces. It's really quick, it's easy, and it's efficient and consistent is the key word. I mean, if you're going to anneal, if you got half of them annealed and the other half didn't take because you get the temperature right, now you've got a real big train wreck as far as accuracy goes, because you're going to have half your cases annealed and half of them are not. And then, of course, you are going to have a case trimmer. We have power trimmers here. You can buy them that you can single hand turn and trim the cases by hand. So you're going to trim the cases, and you're going to have to chamfer the case mouse then and make sure that there's no burrs or anything like that. When it comes to the process of reloading, this isn't teaching you, it's just giving you some food for thought. Make sure you read the owner's manual in the kit that hopefully you're going to buy. So hopefully you'll buy a kit. You get a nice discount because you're going to get all of these tools that you're going to need in one shot. And then you're going to read the book and learn how to use each and every single one properly. And so make sure that you're going on there, not just watching somebody on YouTube, a sensation, an expert, and make sure that you're going to the people that are actually making the products that we use. They're experts in their field. Take the time to read. Take the time to read your dies, how to set up. Take the time to read how the balance beam scale sets up and balances out. Take the time to use caution, as you slow this process down, that you're doing your research before you do the reloading to make sure that you're aware of everything and anything that's going on. I will say that make sure you wear safety glasses. When you're seeding primers, you can get one to pop off, and if you've got a big column of primers inside some of these automated systems, the whole tube can blow. I've not seen that personally, but I have seen one primer go off when I was seeding one. It's loud. Make sure you're wearing eye protection. The other thing is make sure that when I'm handling the brass, especially with a lot of the different lubricants and stuff, I try to keep air moving because we're reloading a lot, and we have reloaded a lot. And I also wear gloves as well. Just for the record, your skin absorbs everything. And so if you're handling a lot of lubricants, especially if they got warning signs all over them, it's different for what we do because we're not just touching it for 10 minutes. We might be playing with this stuff for a couple hours. And you're going to be doing this for the next 10, 15 years, and that's where the problem starts. So I wear gloves as much as it sounds. Maybe some guys would frown at that or say, hey, he wears gloves while he's reloading. That's funny. But I do because I know, even machining and all the stuff that we use in the other parts of the business that we do, some of these chemicals can really hurt you long term, especially if they're being absorbed through your skin, and they will. And so I always wear gloves and just use caution. I want to make it for another 50 years would be nice, and hopefully shooting for another 30 would be nice. I don't want that to end early because of an exposure to a really bad chemical for long periods of time. So in next week's podcast, we're going to go and talk about setting up and starting the actual reload. Again, this is not instructional. And so you cannot listen to this podcast and say, I'm going to go make ammunition by listening to this podcast and make that is not what this is for. But next week's episode, we are going to get into setting things up properly, some things to look at while you're setting up, making sure that you're getting the correct measurements, some of the different ways people do set up and reload, and some of the pros and cons of each. So we're actually going to start talking about making the actual load of the ammunition. One thing I want to throw out there is we did change up our long-range shooting school. It is a 3-day school, of course, and it has always been. And we will keep the main school 3 days simply because that third day allows us to be a true level 1 and 2 course, and it gives us just more time to finish what we started. So if we only made it a 2-day course, we would get you 80% of the way there. Then we would have to bring you back for 2 more days, day one just to get you up to speed to where we left off, and day two to continue on what we want to teach you on the third day. That would be basically a 3-day course. So I think in the long term, yes, it's an extra day here, but it saves you that time from going back and having to start and do a whole day of training to get to the point where you stopped and then continue another day to pick up what you wanted to learn. And so it's a 3-day course. And then the other part is we allow people to come in and pick up their rifle, getting it fitted properly, getting it zeroed, getting it chronographed, getting everybody comfortable with it. And I think that's really important. So it's, you don't have a Ferrari delivered to your door without ever touching it or driving it, and anyone explaining how to adjust the seat and how to turn the stereo on. And so we want you to be able to come in with the rifle if you decide to purchase one of our custom rifles and go over everything with it and spend that time with you getting it set up properly, adjusting the length of the pull, showing you how to adjust the cheek piece, things to tighten, what to tighten to. It's just to become really familiar with your rifle and make the first range experience a great one. I mean, we've done this so many times over the years. So we just announced 2 dates that we open in July. If you'd like to join us, love to have you. So guys, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us. This is part 2 of our series. We're going to continue on to part 3 next week, and then we're going to hopefully be doing some interviews at the end of it all, maybe talking to some people in the industry that could give us some pointers. So my goal is to wrap up this series is to bring on a couple guests that are inside the industry, ask them some questions that maybe would be beneficial to the new shooters, let them talk about some points and things that they would like to pass on to you, and hopefully get a lot of good information out to you that way as well. So we'll get some people from the industry to actually spend some time on the phone with us discussing some things that they think are important to pass along to you, the listener. So guys, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. We certainly really appreciate it. We always like to ask if you enjoy the podcast to please share it, like it, leave a comment if you would like. That helps us, other people find us easier, as well as moves us up through the ranks, and we really certainly appreciate that. We've got a great following and people leaving really nice comments. If there's anything that you would like us to talk about, of course, please email me anytime here. It's contact@wolfprecision.net, and maybe we'll consider it for a future podcast, or if there's someone you would like us to reach out to, maybe consider them for an interview. Love to do that as well. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. So my name is Jamie Dotson. I'm your host, and you are listening to the Long Range Shooting and Custom Rifle Building Podcast.